The Vietnamese jungle was silent, but not for long. The sound of footsteps grew closer, mingling with the distant drone of insects. Then, an abrupt roar shattered the tranquility. An American soldier, his eyes wide, watched in stunned disbelief as one of his buddies was thrown into the air, engulfed in smoke and debris. The anticipation of a new battle had become a brutal reality in the blink of an eye. The smart mines, buried in the soil, had finally revealed their lethality. The battlefield, once just a labyrinth of green, was becoming a silent graveyard. On the battlefield, every step could be your last, the young soldier thought, his mind racing through the stories he'd heard from the old-timers. The uncertainty of every movement was becoming oppressive. As the chaos unfolded, the sound of explosions echoed through the jungle, a macabre symphony. The pained cries of his squadmates rang out, creating an atmosphere of terror. Each blast represented not just physical destruction, but the ruin of a spirit that believed in a controllable war. This first taste of combat was tied to an invisible, omnipresent factor. That explosion was merely the first of many, a powerful demonstration of American technology that, though unseen, could not be ignored. As panic consumed his fellow soldiers, he reflected, how could the enemy possibly stand against something so deadly? With rising anticipation, the American troops executed their battle plans, relying on their new innovation, smart mines. These fatal weapons were designed to detect movement and, once triggered, unleash devastating explosions. The soldier, in a moment of clarity, recognized that these machines weren't just tools, but a kind of living thing on the battlefield, alert, waiting for the right moment to strike. The intelligence behind these mines was their ability to distinguish between a hostile presence and a passing animal. With each explosion, the perception of control over the war evaporated, creating a battlefield that defied human expectations. The psychological impact of these mines wasn't just immediate, it was profound. The stories of what the troops were facing grew more and more wild, and the fear of the mines became a lurking monster, a revelation that turned familiar ground into cursed earth. The soldiers felt paralyzed, stalked not only by a moving enemy, but by the invisible threat of a device that could seal their fate in an instant. The VietCongs, so far resilient, would have to change tactics, to re-evaluate their own perception of the battlefield. But above all, America's new technology heightened the uncertainty of the military's future in the region. The image of his wounded buddy would be seared into the squad's collective memory. Their movements could no longer be based on training. Adaptability had become the priority in this hostile environment. The young soldier felt the adrenaline pump through his veins as he realized he had to watch the ground before he watched the horizon. The steel of the mines reflected more than light. It reflected the fragility of human life. Like a chess match, each advance across the terrain became a matter of luck and strategy. This operation would be just the first of many in a theater where every step was precarious. The troops' orders changed, emphasizing a new approach to the fight. The soldiers were instructed to use a more cautious, methodical technique, as if they were navigating a field of tripwires. Curiosity about how the Viet Cong would react was a ticking clock that had stopped. The real battle would transcend visible firefights. The mines, with their lethal efficiency, ensured that every move could be the difference between life and death. What was about to become a battlefield would soon evolve into a shadowy struggle between adaptation and resistance. The anticipation of the Viet Cong's reaction was mixed with the fear and uncertainty of the advance. The veterans' stories swirled like a thick fog in the soldier's mind. And as the jungle wrapped its arms around these men, the stage for true terror and adaptation was about to be set. With every blast, the question that still lingered in his mind echoed off the jungle leaves. But how could the enemy possibly stand against something so deadly? As the echo of the explosions faded in the jungle, a new era of combat was dawning. The smart mines, which had caused such terror among the soldiers, were not just a lucky break in the American arsenal, but a gift of military engineering that sought efficiency in a chaotic war. These small weapons, with their discreet and subtle forms, were more than simple explosives. Each unit was designed with technology that made them extremely effective at detecting movement on the battlefield. A hidden motion sensor, a battery, and an explosive charge capable of tearing a man apart in seconds. To the strategists, it was the perfect example of modern warfare. The young soldier, his eyes now accustomed to the terror these mines could inflict, began to understand the logic behind their creation. Mines that could distinguish between friend and foe, that left a trail of uncertainty on ground that once seemed safe. This was more than military tech. It was the epitome of America's adaptation to the guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong. However, it also brought a psychological stigma. The fear of stepping on the ground, of each step balancing between the hope of survival and the reality of death, dominated the minds of the soldier and his comrades. The disparity between American weaponry and the simple but effective tactics of the Viet Cong became a recurring theme among the troops. While the soldiers thought of the mines as their salvation, the Viet Cong warriors saw them as a new challenge. Faced with a new battlefront, the Vietnamese leadership quickly began to change its approach. The mines, which had been an invisible threat, became a focal point in their military discourse. The old ambush tactics had to be readapted. Now it wasn't enough just to attack. Slowly, the lessons from the ground, covered in death and destruction, became clear. The Viet Cong, known for their resilience and adaptability, began to use the skills they already possessed. With their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they became masters at circumventing the mines. They created sophisticated camouflage tactics, using natural cover to misdirect movement. They used the art of cunning to fake their actions and movements, melting into the shadows and becoming ghosts of the jungle. The American soldiers, stunned, began to feel the pressure of uncertainty, which before had only come from the blast of a mine. They were, in fact, the hunted. As the confrontations progressed, the battlefield became a terrain composed of both mines and the bloody guerrilla traditions of the Viet Cong. The American soldiers, briefed on the mine's specifications, had come to believe their technological superiority would be a definitive advantage. With the accelerating pace of the war, the continuous quest for situational control became a real challenge. The mines were an extension of that quest. But the reality was that there was no absolute control in a territory dominated by unpredictability and the enemy's knowledge. With each passing day, the explosives exacted a higher psychological toll on the soldiers. What was once seen as a solution was evolving into a burden, a weight that wore down military reasoning. With every step, fear radiated like a reflex. Combat operations now involved a deep emotional attrition, as the mines turned their military home into a hell of second-guessing and uncertainty. The fight wasn't just on the front lines, but in the captive minds of the soldiers dealing with the consequences of the new technology. Each mission was a new chance to observe the constant transformation between aggression and adaptation. The smart mines didn't just alter military tactics, they transformed the very essence of the fight. This new landscape meant modern war wouldn't be decided by advanced weapons alone, but also by the mental game between two constantly evolving sides. And in this battle, the resistance of the Viet Cong became a question of who would adapt more effectively to the cruel realities emerging in a highly volatile context. But the difficulties were just the beginning. For the American soldiers, this reliance on technology for protection would become a double-edged sword, and the war's developments would prove unexpected. The future looked menacing, and the question that continued to reverberate in every soldier's mind was whether the Viet Cong's adaptability could match the innovation of the Allied front. Clear and precise answers would be scarce. The war was far from a conventional battle. It was a deadly game where adaptation and resistance were the only ways to survive, signaling that the true impact of the new technology was just beginning to be revealed. The first deployments of the smart mines became crucial moments in a conflict that was already a testing ground for innovation and adaptation. On a misty July morning in 1966, the operation known as Skull was a turning point. The American troops, aware of the mine's importance in their new combat doctrine, prepared for action in a sector known for its dense vegetation and for being a refuge for Viet Cong warriors. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers readied themselves. The advance would be slow, methodical. With the horror of previous explosions still fresh in their minds, every step was veiled in a fog of caution and fear. The operation began with a series of coordinated airstrikes, F-4 Phantom II jets flew over the area, dropping explosive payloads in an attempt to dismantle enemy positions and clear the terrain. The hope was that, under a blanket of destruction, the mines could be placed safely, preventing the Viet Cong warriors from devising evasion strategies. Each bomber had a distinctive sound, like the roar of a dragon breathing fire and destruction. The ground shook under the soldiers' feet, as the echoes of the explosions were followed by screams and smoke. Once the ground was properly prepped, the soldiers began to implant the mines. These weren't ordinary mines, but advanced detection devices that could discern between movements of different sizes. The expectation was that, in a technological duel, American superiority would become a reality on the ground. In the heart of the jungle, the troops positioned the mines with precision. They became silent sentinels from that moment on. With each mine buried, a new layer of protection was added to the American strategy. However, the questions among the soldiers still hung in the air. Are we ready for what happens next? Meanwhile, on the other side, the Viet Cong watched. With a deep knowledge of the terrain and vegetation, their trained eyes were on the lookout as suspicions became reality. Since their losses had been minimized by the airstrikes, the Viet Cong's adaptability kicked in. Their guerrilla mindset manifested in new tactics. Instead of a frontal assault, they decided to infiltrate the jungle and use the shadows. The absence of movement was the new strategy, to erase their footprints, becoming as invisible as the ghosts that inhabited the green mesh. Over the following days, tension grew among the American ranks. The soldiers were on constant alert. Every small movement in the field sparked a sense of doubt. Shadows among the trees, the buzz of insects, everything made the field hostile, a place to be feared, where life and death danced side by side. A new communication system was introduced, hand signals and codes to warn one another. What were once laughs and jokes among the soldiers had now turned into silent whispers and careful glances. A week later, the operation planned to advance was at its climax. Motion detections from the mines were starting to trigger alarms. With senses on high alert, the soldiers prepared for what seemed to be an imminent attack. But what followed was an explosion that shook the battalion's spirit. The cry of a Viet Cong guerrilla echoed through the jungle, signaling an immediate reaction. With the alarm raised, the American soldiers understood their inferences were correct. The mines were doing their job, although the advance wasn't going as expected. The ground was now stained red, the heavy price of war beginning to re-emerge. A new concept was born amid the battle. War is becoming a psychological game. The reactions of the Viet Cong warriors, initially of resistance, began to transform. Over time, they returned to the field better prepared, studying the mines' reactions. The territory, though scarred by destruction, became new again, as they dug tunnels through the jungle to avoid the prying eyes of the American soldiers. They infiltrated deeper areas where there was no immediate danger from the detection devices, a recess that would become their renewed tactic. The weight of responsibility fell on the shoulders of the American soldiers with each new operation. The true impact of technology, though evident, foretold an emotional cost that could not be ignored. What was considered a technological advantage was becoming increasingly difficult to calibrate against the realities of combat. And so the battle was far from over. While the smart mines showed their effectiveness, the fight within the minds of the American soldiers and the resistance of the Viet Cong revealed that the war would transcend weapons. What were once just explosives were transforming into a symphony of uncertainty, resonating with each new detonation. The battle had just begun, and the paths the war might take were still uncertain. The weeks passed, and the heat of the Vietnamese summer became increasingly oppressive. Operations intensified, and each day revealed the harsh reality of the fight. Amid the jungle miasma, the sound of the UH-1 Huey helicopter cut through the air like a scream of both hope and terror. It was the symbol of American air power, a herald of discipline and command over the battlefield. The soldiers waited anxiously to board for a new mission that would unfold in Operation Fire Beach, which promised to attack a strategic position fortified by the Viet Cong. On the morning of the attack, the battlefield was covered in a blanket of fog. The pilot, Captain Stevens, looked out the cockpit window, knowing that the lives of the men below him depended on the mission's success. "We can't fail," he thought, as he gave a final nod to the men waiting at the launch pads. The operation was designed to be a decisive blow, using American air superiority to dismantle the Viet Cong troops before they could even raise their heads. The soldiers disembarked in a clandestine field that was barely visible. With rain guards on, they had adaptations for their M16s that brought a sense of security amid the chaos. The Viet Cong position was a few miles away, and the soldiers were armed to the teeth, prepared for both the attack and the unpredictable. A recent firefight at a nearby watering hole, where an intel source had been compromised, had raised the tension. The team was eager to make the enemy feel the pressure of their firepower. The first shots were fired, and then the ground shook under the fury of the rifles. The echoes were intimidating. In moments of pure adrenaline, the American soldiers were resolute. However, the Viet Cong's reaction was methodical. Entrenched in strategic positions, they began to counterattack. Smart mines were already installed throughout the area and became a key part of their defensive tactic. Messages about the enemy's quick reactions spread among the soldiers, generating a mix of excitement and fear. The mines began to go off as the Viet Cong warriors advanced. A true game of cat and mouse unfolded. The sound of explosions cut through the dense vegetation, and the jungle seemed to come alive. The clever placement of the mines became a silent death for many, and frustration began to grow among the American soldiers who, until then, felt that control was in their hands. As all this happened, the day became a series of actions and reactions, and amid the chaos, the sounds provided a constant backdrop of screams and blasts. The roar of war reverberated, echoing through the vegetation. The Viet Cong, who had proven to be determined, did not succumb easily. The hunt had become a true test of endurance, both for those supported by technology and for those who clung to silent hunts on the jungle's edge. One soldier, Sergeant Ryan, a kid from Texas, began to get lost in the shadows of the violence. He had gone through a vigorous training process, but during the operation, he found himself dealing with an invisible enemy. Each step forward meant a new risk, and the reality of war became more than just winning. It was about surviving each day. He saw friends standing beside him, and the bond of brotherhood that had once strengthened him now felt like a brand of loss. Every wound, every cry for a medic, reminded him that the idea of control was just a mirage. Meanwhile, the mines continued their gruesome work. The sounds of explosions became a chorus of strength and vulnerability. The effectiveness of American technology was undeniable, but the Viet Cong were not entirely powerless. They conducted silent, swift offensives that frustrated the operations. For the first time, the American soldiers began to realize they were being hunted as much as they were the hunters. At the climax of the operation, a combination of tactics and technology was at play. The helicopters circled over the area, firing rockets at enemy positions, but each explosion dragged with it a shadow of doubt. With each cacophony of weapons, the line between triumph and chaos grew thinner. The war wasn't simply a matter of attacking. As the soldiers fought to assert themselves, they faced the constant, undeniable presence of fear in their hearts. And so, as Operation Firebeach came to a close, the lessons piled up. What could have been a crushing triumph turned into a warning. The mines were not just tools of destruction. They were constant reminders that every battle faced an adaptable enemy, and every tactical advance required an adjustment in this deadly dance. On a battlefield of aerial reconnaissance, armed intelligence, and guerrilla tactics, the war was just beginning to show its true colors. The echoes of Operation Firebeach still reverberated through the trees of the Vietnamese jungle. For the American troops, however, the war was not a sequence of successful operations, but a labyrinth of losses, uncertainties, and constant adaptations. In the heart of the fight, Sergeant Ryan felt like an actor in a drama where victory became an illusion with each unfolding act. The friends he had lost became constant memories, like shadows in the jungle, and every step forward in combat was a reminder of the price war demanded. It was in August 1966, during the Battle of Khe Sanh, that this fight for survival transformed into the most intense display of conflict yet seen. The American military, reinforced by air power and resources, decided to launch a large-scale attack against Viet Cong positions around the base. Strategically located in mountainous terrain, Khe Sanh was vital for maintaining supply lines and controlling access to other regions. The plan was to use air power to its fullest, delivering a mortal blow to the Viet Cong forces before they could rally for a counterattack. The tension at the base was palpable. The sky was dark with smoke and the imposing shadow of a B-52 Strato fortress flying overhead to conduct the bombing. That massive war machine was capable of dropping a 30-ton payload, equivalent to an entire enemy battalion's arsenal. It was a symbol of American technological superiority. The men looked up, hoping that fierce shadow would bring the hope of victory over an elusive and cunning enemy. The first strikes began with a deafening roar, and the earth trembled under the soldiers' feet. The rain of bombs transformed the landscape, and the ground opened up as if the earth itself were weeping. But victory had a price. Errant bombs and friendly fire began to take their toll, wounding or killing the very soldiers who thought they were safe in the rear. A line of crossfire that confused friend and foe was established, leading to confusion and despair, heightening the anxiety that already permeated the tension. In the heat of battle, Sergeant Ryan once again found himself grappling with his anguish. He led a team forward, confident they could hold the line. The sound of machine guns was incessant, and the air was thick with gunpowder and screams. As they advanced, they felt like they were in a minefield, not just the enemy's but also of their own challenges. Without warning, a mine exploded, tearing the jungle into what seemed like ravenous fragments. He saw one of his friends thrown into the air as pandemonium erupted around them. The Viet Cong forces, in response to the bombing, proved to be more strategically prepared. Using guerrilla tactics, they emerged from their defensive positions and began to execute small attacks. Two-step ambushes where a glimpse of the sky became a luxury as shots echoed among the trees. They were challenging the idea that technology was the savior on the battlefield. They were proving highly adaptable, with maneuvers learned in the shadows of the jungle. At one of the most crucial moments of the battle, with Sergeant Ryan's heart pounding and his mind overloaded, a medevac chopper took a hit, its rotors sputtering. Fear consumed him as he realized time was running out. His orders, once clear and confident, now became empty echoes amid the chaos. He had to lead, but how could he lead his men to victory when the ground itself was so treacherous? The answer wasn't just physical, but emotional. It was a battle for safety, for courage, and for faith in a victory that seemed like a mirage. The heat of the battle intensified, resulting in a cataclysm of emotions among the soldiers. They were in a deadly dance, where American numerical and technological superiority met the cunning and adaptability of the Vietnamese warriors. Minutes passed like hours, as each B-52 strike and each shot fired from the jungle blended into a confusion of hopelessness. Hearts pounded, and the shock of the enemy became palpable. The Battle of Khe Sanh turned into a test of resilience and determination. The Viet Cong's smart mines became deadly traps, and the Vietnamese warriors' ability to create ambushes perpetuated a fight that was not just physical, but also psychological. On that fateful day, the war was irrevocably intertwined with its technological lens and the insane struggle for survival. On that day, among the dead, the wounded, and the footprints on the green camouflaged earth, the war was no longer defined solely by military superiority. Instead, it revealed itself in nuances of humanity. The Battle of Khe Sanh became a symbol not just of the fight, but of a confrontation against the enemy and against the personal ghosts each man carried. And so, as the dust settled and the jungle shadows drew near, the story of the struggle was immortalized, already holding sweet and bitter memories, a constant reminder that war is never simple. It is a complex tapestry of tactics, lost lives, and the eternal adaptation to chaos. As the dust from the Battle of Khe Sanh began to settle, the sound of explosions and gunfire faded, replaced by the echo of what had been a true field of horror. For the American soldiers, every crack of a rifle, every cry of a fallen comrade, and every mine blast were bitter lessons in a war that seemed to have no end. But while the American combatants recovered amidst the chaos, the perspective of the Viet Cong offered a new narrative, theirs. The Vietnamese warriors had watched closely, and their lessons were different. They were adapting their strategy in real time, evaluating and adjusting based on what they saw in the fight. At the Viet Cong command headquarters, in a small cave deep in the jungle, there was a mix of relief and determination. What should have been a bitter defeat had turned into a tactical triumph. Colonel Nguyen, a shrewd commander who had led his troops in several battles, contemplated the outcome of the recent operation at Khe Sanh. "We know the Americans' technology is impressive," he told his officers, "but what they don't understand is our resilience. They are equipped to win on a traditional battlefield, but we fight on our home turf, unseen and unpredictable." Nguyen's words resonated with his officers, who understood the essence of the war as they understood life in Vietnam: resistance, adaptation, and a shared existence in the jungle. Contrary to what many believed, that battle was not just a matter of technological superiority. It was a testament to the ability of a people who resisted with determination. They were in a continuous cycle of learning and adaptation, and the Khe Sanh Theater had become a living laboratory for guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong soldiers were in constant motion, using the depths of the jungle as their cloak. The traps they set for the Americans, hidden mines and meticulously planned ambushes, were not mere tactics, but an extension of their people's very soul. The dense jungle flora became their ally as they built a network of tunnels that not only hid them, but also formed a communication and supply network that defied conventional American methodology. Meanwhile, reports on the battle reached the American headquarters, and the psychological impact began to set in. The narrative was changing. Intelligence materials that were once signs of confidence turned into concerns about integrity and effectiveness. American military analysts, realizing they were not just fighting a conventional force but an adaptive insurgency, began to re-evaluate strategies. "We have to understand that this war isn't about guns or technology, but about people. About the determination of a man who knows how to fight for his country," a captain declared during a tactical analysis. The conditions on the battlefield revealed a dangerous cycle. As they tried to impose control and superior force, the Viet Cong proved increasingly resilient, exploiting the weaknesses of the American troops. Empathy was becoming a critical tool, but it could not yet be translated into manuals or combat protocols. Losses mounted and morale was falling, as the concept of the invisible enemy became a constant torment for the soldiers. A turning point occurred when Captain Stevens and his team were sent on a reconnaissance mission, now carrying the memory of the Battle of Khe Sanh in their minds. What they didn't expect was that the jungle itself would transform into a new theater of war. As they ventured out, the volatility of the terrain seemed to threaten them at every moment. The lessons learned from technological creations were being overwritten by the realities of guerrilla warfare: ambushes, communication failures, and a dynamic where expectations were put to the test. Amid this complex reality, the final confrontation whispered on the wind. Tensions between the American troops and the Viet Cong were beginning to reach a new peak. Captain Stevens, in a tense conversation with his superiors at a forward operating base, expressed what many soldiers were thinking. "We're not just fighting the Viet Cong, we're fighting the soul of a nation." His observation resonated like a dose of reality, forcing the leaders to re-evaluate their tactics. As both sides fought against shadows, one an armed and determined force, the other a people resisting through their very culture, an adaptation to the brutal realities of war was underway. It was a dangerous dance where death, in all its devastating forms, was ever present. And the lessons for both the American soldiers and the Viet Cong guerrillas accumulated in a context that made this war more than a conflict. It transformed it into a testament to the human struggle for survival and the tireless quest for freedom. In that clash, the concepts of victory and defeat were, for many, just matters of perspective. Every victory, after all, was paid for with the lives that were lost. The fight was far from over, and the jungle continued to whisper secrets of resistance. The war in Vietnam stretched on like a shadow, intense and continuous, holding the world in its somber allure. The scars left by battles like Khe Sanh became landmarks of a struggle that was not just for territory, but for absent hearts and minds. On the battlefield, the United States faced not only the Viet Cong but its own limitations in understanding a conflict that transcended weaponry and traditional strategies. The battle was filled with intertwined narratives. Victory, loss, and resistance became the trails through which each side navigated. Captain Stevens watched his team of soldiers, now more shaped than ever by the harsh reality of war. They were no longer the green recruits who had landed in Vietnam. They had become fire-hardened warriors whose eyes carried a new wisdom and, at the same time, a weight that seemed unbearable. Each of them knew that the challenges ahead were not just physical. The battle was expanding into a psychological war, with the enemy becoming a sinister and complex figure who moved in the darkness. For the American soldiers, the concept of the soul of a nation took on a more tangible form, revealing not only the entity fighting against them, but also a cunning adversary with a deep connection to their land and culture. The Viet Cong forces under Nguyen's command became increasingly astute in their tactics. The colonel led a cycle of adaptations, learning from every mistake and every defeat. "We do not fight only against the Americans. We fight against a machine that does not understand our spirit," he told his men, whose faces reflected determination. Nguyen's words resonated in the jungle and echoed in their maneuvers, weaving a web of ambition and struggle. While the Americans were relentless in their tactics, the Viet Cong used their resilience as a weapon in itself. Their guerrilla techniques, the art of invisibility, becoming an immortal symbol in the fight for sovereignty. The war, as it revealed itself, was not a concept of total victory or absolute defeat. The fighting came to be measured by the lives lost and the emotional impact on those who endured. Historically, the Vietnam campaign would change the military paradigm. The lesson was clear. What was needed was more than just technology. It was adaptation to a dynamic and constantly changing battlefield. And so, over the years, the scars of the war began to integrate into the social fabric, not just of Vietnam, but of the United States, which struggled internally to understand its role on the world stage. Protests began to emerge, and the American political scene became a microcosm of the conflict's complexity. The dialogue became a cry for freedom and justice, reflecting a recognition that wars are not fought only on battlefields, but in the minds and hearts of a people. In the end, the Vietnam War would be a story of dualities. Both sides would have their victories and their tragedies, and the recognition of human dignity amidst the chaos would complicate the concept of triumph. The conflict itself would show that the memory of the fallen would remain a testament to the complexities faced, not just by the brutality of physical war, but by humanity's ability to find meaning even in the darkest hours. Thus, as the smoke cleared and the sun shone through the canopy, the jungle, now filled with stories of struggle and survival, held the secrets of a past that would shape an entire future. The story of the Vietnam War would not be told merely in numbers and battles. It would carry the reality of the human experience, the pain of loss, the celebration of resistance, and ultimately the determination of a people who, in the face of despair, rose up and fought. The legacy of the war would echo through generations. New wars would bloom in other corners of the world, and the lessons of Vietnam would become an integral part of modern military strategy. The timeline of the war would stretch on, and what began in tension would soon transform into a call to action that would reverberate eternally. The spirit of a people, like their desire for freedom, would never be extinguished. The Battle of Khe Sanh, the determination of Nguyen, and the sacrifice of the American soldiers would be woven into the single fabric of the human condition, the unending quest to understand, learn, and survive. And so, the jungle would continue to whisper the eternal truths of resistance and the fight for life itself. In this context, the invaluable lessons of the Vietnam War would remain like flares that light up the night, brilliant and revealing, illuminating our paths to the deepest truths about what it means to be human in times of conflict.